Oh, we've got a few people already.
12 participants.
And I think we're almost live. Let's have a look. Yeah, beautiful. So, good morning from Queensland. It's still the morning here, but we are broadcasting this. Well, this program's been specially created for our Victorian audiences of the Legacy Reflections on Mabo exhibition. So, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the countries that we're all connecting from, the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and sea. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and future. So I'm connecting in from Bindal and Walkarukuba country. You might want to put in the chat box there where you're connecting in from. So this morning we've got the privilege of having Gail Mabo, the co-curator of Legacy Reflections on Mabo, in conversation with Joe Lankester and Ron McBurnie. And they're going to be talking about the curatorial premise of the exhibition. They're also going to be talking about their process and how they worked with the materials that Gail shared with them from her personal archive and her kind of history and her father's narrative, Eddie Kyoki Mabo. Now I'm just trying to flip slides here. Come on. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Kate O'Hara. I'm the director of Umbrella Studio Contemporary Arts in North Queensland. So we worked with Gail to produce this exhibition. She also worked with Dr. Jonathan McBurnie and Kelly Williams as co-curators on the project. Now, Kate, I just want to get the slide to change. Bear with me. Oh, no, we've gone back. Let's go forward. So the exhibition's currently on at Burrinja Centre in Victoria. There's 5 more days to go to visit the exhibition in person, so I encourage you to get down there. I know you guys have been in lockdown for a long period, so I'm sure you're keen to get out and see art in person. This particular program has been supported by the Australian Government's Visions Australia program. So I'll just do a little introduction to everyone today. So Gail Mabo is the daughter of Eddie Kyoki Mabo. She's the caretaker of his legacy. So hence this show being called Legacy Reflections on Mabo. She's also a visual artist. She's an activist, a performer and a writer. Her work's been exhibited internationally and nationally as an artist and has been collected by the NGV, Quagoma, the Maritime Museum. And during 2018 and 2019, she worked on this show, which came about, I understand, from a conversation at CIAF at the Cairns Indigenous Art Fair. We've also got Jo Lankester. So she's an artist who studied at the Victorian College of the Arts. She moved to Townsville in 1998. She's been exhibiting for more than a decade and has worked with Umbrella a lot in the past. We've also got Ron McBurnie, who's an artist and an educator, and he's been exhibiting for a number of decades, and he's been the teacher of a lot of North Queensland artists. He has an exhibition opening at Art Space Mackay in March this year, so if you're up this way, you might want to check that out. Now, what I thought I might do is hand over to Gail, and Gail's going to introduce the exhibition and how it came about and how she worked with the artists to create the work.
Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us here on our live chat. I don't know where to look, whether I look at you guys, but I've got 4 little squares over here that I'm talking to my other panelists. And so what it is when I was at CIAF for the 25th anniversary of Mabo, and they actually asked me to do some works on how I saw my dad. And so I sort of I had to reflect on my own father to go, okay, this is how I want to showcase him. So I made 4 bamboo mats and I had them on the wall, and, you know, some of the comments were a little bit weird because my fellow artists, were always seeing me doing acrylic on canvas, and I turned up with these 4 small sculptural pieces, and they sort of just looked at me and were like, oh, minimalist art. And I went like, yep, but having fun. And I said, well, it's not actually about me, it's actually about my dad. And then as I was standing there with Jonathan, I said, well, if this is the reaction I'm getting from my fellow Indigenous artists, I said, how does non-Indigenous artists see Mabo? How would they reflect on what they actually understand about what my dad has achieved? So with that, we left Kayaf, we came back to Townsville, and then Jonathan and I sat down and we talked about how it, for me, how I felt that other people would see my dad, and if it would be the same as what I would, or would they see it as a completely different thing? So that's where we had the conversation about inviting non-Indigenous artists to be part of this, because I said, well, as part of reconciliation, I said, and a part of appreciation, we have to allow other people to have a go at doing art about a subject matter, and the subject matter being my dad. And then with that, we went down the path of selecting artists, and artists that I knew and I loved their works, and people that I knew would get, for me, do the best they can to show my father in the best way they could. And that's why, the 2 panelists that we have here with me, Joe and Ron, I consider them to be great artists within the Townsville sector, but also in their own right, fantastic people. But I'm glad to say that they are my friends too. And with that, with being friends and having a dialogue about how this man came to be and to do what he did, it was just through that little conversation that, for me, opened up a bigger doorway, because then we had to really look at who Dad was, because, I knew him as my dad and knew him as all these things, but, the archives that are in the National Library and some of the things that he started in Townsville, and his passion for his people, passion for his cultural connection to country, all of that had to be sort of given to the artists that we selected, because one of the things was, well, I can say you can go and Google it, but, if we do a little video and go, okay, let's walk on country, and I'll tell you what he was doing here. Like we went out to JCU and walked through the grounds at JCU, because he was the gardener. And I remember, because one of the things was, when he was doing his gardening job, I would go and actually be part of his little team, because he would give me a rake and a wheelbarrow and tell me to go over to particular parts of the grounds to clean and tidy for him, because the grounds were so big, and it was his job. It was his real job. That was a job he was getting paid for. But before that, he was actually, so during the day, he would be the bus driver for our school. He would be the principal, the cultural teacher, he would do the grounds, he would clean the grounds at the school, and then he would do the bus run at the end of the day. And then of a night, he would write all the grants for the school. And so during the day, when we'd finish school, he'd come home, get out of his principal clothes, put on his gardener clothes, and go out and do his real job. And so he'd then sort of say to us, who wants to come with us? And so I'd go, okay, well, I put my hand up, go, well, I'm coming. Because at that time, the kids at, my siblings would all be sitting in front of the telly and go, no, we don't want to come. And I went like, well, I'm not sitting in here with you guys, because we all fight over the television, because there's only 2 stations. It was either watch that station or watch the other station. So I thought, I'll leave it to you guys. I'm going to go hang out with Dad. And so when that was happening, I would then go from, washing the bus, because that was my job, to then changing my clothes and then going into doing, getting the rake and doing that. And then, but see, one of those, and that's where all those stories about what we collected and what he planted came out through that, my time just hanging with him there. And so for me, with that and sharing those stories, that's where I think it gave it a bigger platform for the artist to actually have more information about Dad. And the information that I had, my own personal, well, I had books, I had notes, I had, you know, some of the things from his court case. And so different people looked at different things differently. So that's where it's like I had to give a whole lot of information so they'd all get an understanding about who he was and why he was doing what he did. But for me, it was that whole thing of just sharing my dad, because, you know, I believe he's big enough that we can share him with everybody. So I'm not greedy, I'll share. So yeah, that's how that came about, and how then working out what the name was, what it would look like, and then yeah, and when the artist gave the works for me, it was quite emotional, because it was that whole thing of like, this is how people see my dad, and I was really glad that they had given just little bits of their own self to it also, because, you know, to do an art piece, you can do it about somebody, but you also give it about that person. And when you give it about that person, you take on a personal connection. And that's why with Joe and Ron, my personal connection is that, you know, we're really good friends. And so with many of the other artists too, I am friends with. And there were a couple that I'm not friends with, but I also actually understand that, you know, they live in different areas, but their interpretations for me was fantastic. So yeah. Kate, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for that, Gail. It's good to get a feel for how the exhibition started, and also your sort of really generous kind of sharing of your family stories, and creating a kind of personal connection for the artists to your father, but also then that gets shared to the audiences.
Yeah.
So I thought we might invite Ron to just talk through what kind of material and stories he responded to, and how he created his work for the exhibition.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. My take, or my entrance to the work I did was through Gail, and I for many years have worked with Gail in the studio, and we've made many monotypes and relief prints and so on. And while we were making some of those prints, Gail would tell me stories, and particularly those related to her dad. And so there were a number of those stories that when we're working, we'd just be chatting away and she'd tell me something that I found really interesting. And to sort of move forward a bit, we went to this area at the back of the Eddie Mabo Library, and it's a little creek, and it's a creek called the Wadamulai Creek, and it's very often has no water in it, a little bit of water, so it doesn't flood very often. And Gail was telling us, well, there was a group of us, and she was telling us this story about that her dad planted the bamboo, and you can see the bamboo in these images that we're looking at, and that sometimes she would go down and get permission and take some of the bamboo home and do work with it, which I really liked. But she was also telling us this story of Eddie planting these yams within the sort of the bounds of the creek, and then he'd pick the yams, and they'd have the yams for the family and so on. But one particular yam was a sort of a rogue, you'd call it a rogue yam, and it wasn't noticed until a long time later, and it grew very, very big, and it was growing between the rocks, wedged between the rocks. And I remember asking Gail, what was the shape of this yam? And she said, oh, it was flat and heart-shaped. And that got me thinking about maybe using this yam, this heart-shaped yam that was sort of, it grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually Gail said they dug it up, and it took a while to dig up. And then Eddie cut that yam up and gave parts of it to different members of the community, which I really liked. So it had a sort of for me, an element of giving, of sort of giving to other people. So that was what my image was about. And I decided, I did a lot of different studies of the area, and little studies to start with, like the ones we're looking at now, and then eventually did some larger studies, and they were quite sort of gestural and quite open and so on. And the yam started to sort of appear, and the yam for me in this was sort of heart-like, so it was like a pumping heart or something like that. And you could sort of see it down, wedged in the rocks, or wedged in the sort of little bits of water that was left in the creek. So it was all based on this this lovely little creek just near the library. It's very easy to find, and I think very important because Eddie was working as a gardener in this area, well, right through the grounds, I guess. But this was a sort of very special area. And it's, as I said, very close to the library. So for me, it was quite a touching story, and one I was proud to because my link, I never met Eddie, so Gail was my link to her dad. So I didn't want to enter this through something I didn't know much about, but only through these personal connections, which were important to me.
Excellent.
There. Sorry. I'm just getting up the final piece. It's a triptych, but this slideshow, driving me nuts. Gail, did you have any sort of questions for Ron about is there anything that did you find challenging about the process, or sensitivities that you kind of were thinking through?
So with Ron, what it was when we were making pieces together and just sharing those stories, it was that whole thing of like just his curiosity about and sort of just asking those little bit of questions about why did he do it, and the whole process of me telling him that because it was so big that he had to get a cane knife to it to cut it and give me pieces to run back to the car. It was that whole thing of like, when we plant things and if it's in abundance, we share with everybody. So that's why at the time, so you're talking about the 70s, and I'm all of like 8, 9, helping Dad, running backwards and forwards to the car as if he needed things. But in Townsville at the time, there was like, would have been 50 families of Torres Strait Island people. Now we've got like, 12,000. So, if we had plenty, well, we'd only give it to immediate family now. But back then, we shared it with all the families who were in Townsville because it was so big. Because one of the things is you don't let, this sort of food go to waste, because in the Torres Straits, everybody eats yam and it's delicious. So yeah. So for me, that's I liked what you did, Ron. Your interpretation here of this triptych is, I like it. So yes.
Great.
So did you want to share a little bit about what material you responded to and your process? Interestingly, we've chosen 2 artists who actually responded to a similar kind of site. So it's great to be able to have 2 different takes on it.
You say for me to respond, sorry?
Yeah, if you just want to walk us through.
Yeah, so we've got a very similar connection to Gail. Both Ron and I have worked with Gail to create prints, and we've both been lucky to for Gail to share stories with us during that process. And I think we've connected on multiple things, and ironically, both Ron and I have taught at JCU, and that's also a connection to Eddie and Gail. So it's interesting, we've both chosen the same location. And my connection to Eddie, I think too, is like growing up as a child, he was always in the news and the media, And my mother's very interested in politics, and particularly in Eddie Mabo's court cases, and so it was very prominent in my childhood growing up. Like Ron, I never got to meet Eddie, but you know, I've been lucky enough to, you know, meet Gail and be friends with Gail and work together, and come to this same place. So I think when you're talking about the video that you created earlier, for all the artists to hear a bit of the story about Eddie, get to know him and place, and we were invited to how we would respond to the art in creating artwork for the show, whether it would be by place or politics or by person. And I decided to connect by place, and visiting the same spot as Ron, and walking through there and thinking about the story of the yam too, and looking at the bamboo. And there's my connection with Gail through print, is making some prints of the bamboo maps that Gail had created of her dad, and memory of her dad. Yeah, there they are. And so I was very drawn to the bamboo and very drawn to the creek. So place was very, very important for me to connect to. And my work practices are very different to Ron. I did make one sketch and walk through there, and just took a lot of notes. And my methods and process to working is based on memory. So Gail talked earlier about all the memories of her dad and sharing those stories. And for me, I've really connected to the memory of the stories that Gail has shared with me about place and Mer Island. And my connection to trees is similar, or it has a connection with Gail and family as well, about boundary trees on Mer Island, how that separates people's plots or land, and how Eddie had planted boundary trees at JCU around this creek. And there was other things in that video too that were spoken about, with bloodlines and ocean and the coral and place. So I really chose to respond to that. And this area at JCU Creek, I chose this to work from in terms of marks and maps. Maps is something that's in my work as well, but very differently to Gail's maps. I do a lot of bushwalking, and I'm taking in my environment and I'm mapping the landscape through experience and the physicality of place. So I've applied my methods and process of my practice to visiting this location and taking in colours and tones mixed with the memories of stories, and some marks that I found in these trees in particular that may, like that root that's coming out of, or another part of a tree that's connected to that tree, in creating the marks that represent bloodlines in the actual print. And there's a bit of tone and colour going on there as well. But mixing, when I made my final print, I was thinking about what Mer Island would look like to me, like flying over the corals and the ocean, as well as pulling in the association of bloodlines and place. So maps. So mine is is mapping the landscape through my memories and the stories Gail has told. Yeah. So yeah, and I flew to Weipa, and so I was the oceans flying over there. I was imagining what would be the ocean around Mer Island could be similar. So I was tying in my experience of place to Gail's stories of place. Yeah.
Cool. I do like this image. It's really nice.
Stunning.
Yeah.
It's so detailed when you get to see it in person. I just saw in the chat box from Baranja that actually the show's been extended down there. So you've got until the 28th of February. So you actually can see this in person for a longer period, or visit it multiple times.
Yeah.
So was there anything, Jo, that you found I guess particularly challenging? I feel like of an artist, it's a big thing to ask to respond to such a huge, important figure. Did you find it intimidating at all, or is it the relationship with Gail made it kind of, I guess, a little more comforting that you could, engage with her about it?
I think very much so. Knowing Gail made it very comfortable. I think my only difficulty would, I steered away from the politics because I don't feel very confident in that area, or strongly opinionated. I am strongly opinionated, but I don't know how to express that, I think. So my work is more, it's not overtly political, but they're always about the environment and our impact on the environment. And knowing Gail and Eddie's environment, how important that is for them, and to have rights over that land, I felt the best way for me to express my views is through mapping that landscape through the stories that Gail's told. So I think that was a challenge for me, but I think it's like our impact, not just from a political sense on how land can be lost or damaged, but also our environmental impact. And we've got our climate change happening and waters rising. And so we've had, I think Mer Island's had a lot of threats, current threats and past threats that are still very current now. And yeah, I think my challenge was how to express those political views without overtly doing it.
Yeah, interesting you say that about, the whole fact of, global warming and how things are changing. On Murray Island, when they have king tides now, it actually laps under the houses of the people who have, the Queensland houses where they're taller. Mm-hmm. So if you have a low house on Murray, well, the water goes through your house. And so, I feel saddened for all the older people who have lower houses, and because the younger generation now who live there have the taller houses. And each time I go back, I always look at the island, and when I go to Dad's place where he was buried, I sort of stand there and go, now I know why you chose to be here. You're above the water level. So he will always be seen, and he will not be disturbed because how high up the hill he is. And so, so I'm sort of thinking, well, forward planning without knowing it. And it's like, and because when I sit with him, the space is so calm that you have lots of time to reflect on many things. So, yeah, interesting.
So feel free, those in the audience, to ask some questions of our panellists. I wonder, while we're waiting for some questions to come through, Gail, we were chatting yesterday, and we were actually talking to some work colleagues about the shape of Mer Island, or Mer. You can correct my pronunciation, Gail.
Yep. You're doing okay.
About the maps that your father did. We were sharing that about a project that's coming up, and the shape of the island and the connection to the dugong story. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
So the whole concept of Murray Island, and the language name is Mer. It's a story that our Zogos say. So our gods, the gods that came to Murray Island, it came in the form of a dugong. So when the dugong hit a bit of sand, it beached itself, and then it turned into our island. And having the island as that shape, if you sit back and you look at it, you can actually see, and you see the gill section of the dugong and its eye when it's lying on the beach. And for me, that was the image that burnt in my brain from when I was little, that Dad constantly drew, because he was into watercolor. So he was an artist himself, because our house was littered with a lot of his watercolors of his interpretation of Castle Hill and the pinnacles, which are just mountainous outcrops within Townsville. And so that's where he would sit, and because the person who inspired him to paint was Albert Namatjira. And so he did watercolor similar style, but it wasn't He had never had any classes with him, but he looked at what he'd done, and he'd sort of paint that way, and he would have then I then found out that he was the first Indigenous person to join the Townsville Art Society. And so doing that, he then learned how to make his own frames. And so he would go through bins at the place where they're framing, and the pieces they throw away. He'd go in, get some pieces out, and actually make his own frame, so all the frames look the same in our house. And so yeah, we'd end up with like 12 pieces on the wall. Some family at different times come and just take the picture off the wall and go, I like this, I'm taking it home, and they'd out the door, and he'd sort of go, but because they're older people, he wouldn't sort of go, no, that's mine, put it back. So he'd let them walk out the door. But hopefully one day I can get reunited with some of those pieces, because, they, to me, it was just the way Dad took his time to enjoy his moments of just enjoying the space where he was living at the time. So yeah.
So Gail, we've got a couple of questions here. One for you.
Okay.
Gareth is asking, you mentioned reflection, and obviously the exhibition title features that same word, and I find it a really reflective exhibition. Did you intend that to be the case from the outset? He's also said it's very political and very powerful, but deeply reflective.
Well, yes, we did, because one of the things is for people to actually understand who my dad was, we have to reflect on what he was, who he was as a person. So with that, that's where we thought that was a really strong word that we could actually use to describe what the exhibition should be. And that's why we actually really pushed on that word, because to me, words are important. Words are something that, it either makes or breaks something. So for us to use reflections, on Mabo, for me, we're looking at what it was, who he was, and why it came to be. So yes.
It's multiple reflections, so it's just not a reflection, it's multiple, because there's, as you said, like having that multiple vantage points expressed from all these different amazing artists, I think, paints a very diverse picture of Australia, really.
It does.
Yeah. We have another question here. So this one's for Joe. The blue stipple in your work is really striking. What does it represent?
Well, it's interesting. The inspiration for that I've taken from marks of bark, but it also represents water, currents, and the land around Mer Island. So I'm looking at the surface of things, and it's got dual, probably representations, but Gail actually saw that in my studio, first printed, and saw it as a map, I think, and it just, for me, it really looks like waters and represents currents, I think, and land rights isn't just the land of the island, it's all in the oceans as well. So it's very much looking at the inspiration from the trees that I saw at JCU, and using those marks, interpreting those marks in my own way to then bring into this work to sort of describe or reflect the water or the land, looking at and how things are, it's all about bloodlines and being passed down through the next generation, and making sure that those waters are good for fishing in and good for swimming in and things like that. So they're representing water.
So we've got another question here. Oop, I'm losing it in the little trail. It's for you, Gail. I'll just get back to it. So Tony Kirk is asking, she's really interested in the fish traps on the island, which played an important part in the court case. She noticed that they feature in the video documentary. You can see them from the air on the beach. And interested to know whether they're still in use and are they being maintained?
So, so the fish traps are maintained by the families who are around those fish traps, because where the fish traps line up, the boundaries between the families are the families that come down, and they actually have to maintain the rock sections around it, and also too standing at the corners of each of the fish traps, looking to the hill to make sure that they're markers. So we have coconut trees that are planted right at the top of the hill, in which continue the line of the boundary, to show us that we stand there to make sure we're right on par. Because if we go slightly to the left, that means we're encroaching on our neighbours, and we can't do that. We have to maintain that our line is where it needs to be. And then we go out across to the next marker, and then that's where it's kept like that. And when it's time to rebuild, it's a time when everyone comes together. There's family up on the beach cooking and making food for us, and then we're in the water replanting all the rocks. And it's not just the men that do it, it's both men, women and children. We all go down to do this because that's the way that we all understand who we are, and keeping our connections to ownership of that place, because it's not just one family. There could be 7 family groups within that space that maintain that connection to that one particular fish trap. So yeah, so it takes a village to maintain many things, not just children, but it's also even our fish traps, to maintain that we can have the fish. Once the fish come in on high tide and get stuck, we then share amongst those family groups, and we all share it together. And when we're doing the traps and we find baby clams, we place them into the center, into the lagoon, to grow big. So when it's time for feasting, we know we can go and harvest our own clam shells in our own fish trap. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
So we've got another question here for you, Gail. Kim's asking, or she's saying, when I hear you speak, it makes me think. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
She's saying, when I hear you speak, it makes me think of the importance of language, but in all its forms. So I'm interested in hearing how you use your art to educate and preserve traditional knowledge.
Okay, so I know Kim. Hello, Kim. So he knows me well, and so for me, the connection to place is every time I do an image, I give it a traditional name, because then it's teaching the broader community about how language is connected to me, to a place, and to a particular thing. So language is, well, when I was growing up, Dad started teaching us language, but he also emphasized that we had to master the English language to walk better in the white world, because for people to understand who we are, where we come from, we need to master the English language, but also understand where we came from. So the connection with language comes through the fact that English, he would push that the English was, the dialect. If we were to say something, say it wrong, he'd pull us up and say, pronounce it properly. And so a lot of my family sort of go, you speak like a white person. For me, it's that whole thing of like, well, if I'm speaking like a white person, it's because my dad told me to. But I'm now stepping into the realm of actually understanding my own language, understanding and getting a grasp on that, and actually seeing the beauty within it. Because for me, language is beautiful. And when my aunties are starting to teach me, it's a slow process. I'm a little bit older now, and so I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to step up and go, yep, I'm going to have a go. So when I do, it's like, it's like when you take a child along and you're teaching a child their first words. It has to be repeated. It has to be repeated, and for them to get an understanding of it, it's through the actions, and because the actions with the language then blends itself together. So when I'm around family and when we're doing things together, they look at me and they say, "Come, I'll show you," and then they'll start talking language to me, and then that's one way that I'm relearning my mother tongue. So for me, that's where I find just doing the language as well as putting it within so my prints, and whenever I'm doing something, I will give it a language name, because it's the educational sector that we need to educate people about our language, because it should be the first thing that people say is like how we do now, welcome to country. We acknowledge the first peoples of this place, as we call them, of their clan group names. The same as, if I was to go somewhere, I would acknowledge those traditional owners of that country that I walk. Same, because it's an appreciation of language. It's appreciation of place. It's appreciation of people. Does that answer your question, Kim? I'm going to put that out there to you, buddy.
Feel free to respond, Kim, in the chat box.
Eso, that means thank you.
So we've got a pretty potent question from Hannah. Gail, she'd love to hear any personal reflections you have on how art is used as a method of navigating and making sense of and surviving a violent colonial legal system. It's interesting that she's sort of talking about that, because your dad was doing that with his maps and you're doing that with your maps. But yeah, how, the potency of art to navigate like a colonial heritage system. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Well, see, so if you think about maps are universal. Maps, everyone looks at a map and they can sort of make heads or tails of what it's used for, how, sometimes you need a hand showing you which way's up. But for me, it's that whole thing of like a map has no boundaries of language, culture, time, or anything, because what it is sharing something that has a universal language. And for me, a map, for my dad's drawing of maps, it showed ownership. It showed his connection to his space. Whereas if you look at a street map, it's your connection to your space. It's where you live. It's how you get from A to B. When I do some workshops with kids and we talk about, if we were to draw a map about from going from your house to your friend's house to school, we turn it into an art piece, because then it's them connecting to where they live. And for us, maps are connecting us to where we live, how we get there, how we navigate through things, how we navigate through time, and not time, but actually using the star maps to navigate on when it's time to do particular things, like when we need to harvest, when we need to plant, when it's time to hunt. So all of those things, a map is something that is universal. And for me, looking at maps and trying to understand how Cook used his maps to, navigate the Australia. For me, that's interesting because of the whole fact that, someone had to go and make markings. And that's what to us that's what maps are. Maps are marks. So a mark can be interpreted in many, many ways. So for me, that's why I I redid my bamboo maps as prints, because I thought, well, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel because it's already there. It's the same as, Cook's map. I didn't reinvent his map because it was already out there in the public realm. So it's my interpretation. So for me, maps help people interpret things, and it's how people then take that knowledge away and share it. It's always up to the individual. So that's how, and, for me, to educate kids on maps and, to actually understand a map and how to use it is good, because if they get lost, they know how to find their way back. So yeah.
That answers another question that was that sort of asking about maps and the nautical kind of ways of navigating and how that knowledge has existed for a long time. And you showed that a lot in your work, Gail, through your Tug-Eye map series, that it does reject Terra Nullius outright because it was, you know, it was happening. Yeah. So we've probably got another 10 minutes or so. So if anyone wants to put their last questions in, we've got Lori-Ann here asking whether you've written a book, and she's saying, if you haven't, please consider it. I'd love to hear more about your life, thoughts, father, the environment, customs and art. And she's got a second question, but I'll let you answer that first.
Okay, so
and are you thinking about it?
The book yes, I am thinking about it. I have started, but it's like all things, you know, life gets in the road, things shift and change, but it's constantly there. I have a book on the side of me that I always put notes down, because those notes also help me with my art, and vice versa. So I'll be doing something and all of a sudden I'll have a memory of something I've done, and something that, you know, because of my next exhibition that's coming up, you know, where I have to reflect on my growing up in my house with my mum and dad. It's like that whole thing of like that book where I make the notes will be very helpful for when I write my own book, because for me, my book, I'll actually let you know what the title will be. It will be The Girl in the Window, because for myself, I was the child that stood with a notebook in hand to see how many people were coming to our house to visit my dad. So I had to make sure there was enough chairs for everybody to sit with them. And because our veranda was divided, the men on this side and the women on this side, so I'd have to make sure there's enough chairs for the men and enough chairs for the women. And then go into the kitchen, turn the kettle on, make sure, you know, there was enough cups and tea for everybody to share. But, you know, and it's resonates from that, just my watching the ongoings of what happened in our house. So yeah, that's what it will be.
So the other question that Lori-Ann had was, are you part of a particular art group in Townsville? As I would love to join a good and inspiring group. Umbrella Studio Contemporary Art, so a pretty lovely community that Gail's involved in. I don't know whether you wanted to answer that question.
Yeah, well, so so Umbrella is the base that, you know, I do my work with, and also just another little group that sometimes, you know, over years was a big group and now sort of just dwindled, but I think it sort of just fluctuates with time, people and place, was Murray's and Ink. And so because we were all Indigenous artists living in Townsville, we made a little group called Murray's and Ink. So we would come together at different times to make and create works together. So yeah, and that was actually cool to be part of.
I wonder, sort of, where before we wrap up, I've got a question here about are there any pictures of your work, Gail, to share? And I might see if I can rustle up a couple, but I wondered if Ron or Joe wanted to sort of talk a little bit about after creating the work and seeing it go on tour, like what, you know, your feelings about what you were a part of, and I guess sort of some final reflections on being part of the project. Ron, can I put you on the hot spot?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, look, it was a great experience for me, and great working with Gail, and also seeing what the other artists' interpretations were. It was a great privilege, and seeing that first exhibition at Umbrella was really wonderful, and to just see the diversity of presentations and, you know, views, which I thought was absolutely wonderful. And it sort of, it filled out, you know, people's ideas of, you know, Eddie Mabo's legacy, and sort of gave us a richer understanding, I think. So yeah, for me, it was fantastic.
Yeah, me too. I feel very privileged to be invited as one of the artists to participate and creating the work. There's always challenges, but so much pleasure in having those challenges as well. And I think, yeah, like Ron, standing in the room with such a variety of responses to the person and the place and the legacy of Eddie. And it's the first tour that I've been a part of, and I sort of forget that it's happening actually. So it's nice that it's nice that we're here today having this conversation and revisiting what our methods were and processes, because I had actually sort of forgotten a little bit. So it's really nice that it's ongoing and continuing, and the conversation is still going. So yeah, I look forward to hearing more and being part of more. Yeah.
Great.
I guess maybe, so just on the topic of Gail's work, I'll direct everybody to visit the NGV site because she's got some work there, and the Quagoma website has a virtual exhibition where you can actually see Gail's work on show. But to sort of wrap up today, we've got a question here that might be a good way to finish. Gail, do you feel like the stories and conversations that have come about from this exhibition have reinvigorated and brought these issues back to the public mind again?
Yeah, it has actually, because, you know, we're going on to the 28-year mark. And for me, it's, you know, it's good always to have that thought about what Mabo achieved, because it's the most recent change to the Australian timeline, and it changed a 200-year-old law. So for me, that's significant. That should be still part of a conversation, ongoing conversation, a dialect to go, okay, well, how we should actually celebrate that too. And that's where, you know, I really like to push that, you know, the 3rd of June was when that verdict came down in honor of my father, that we changed that to be a public holiday, because it's the most positive change to the Australian history that we should actually celebrate. Because we celebrate all the negatives, so why can't we celebrate a positive? And so for me, educating people about the positive change that Mabo's made for the Australian landscape is something that, you know, future generations can hold and stand proudly to say that, you know, this happened for in our country to help Indigenous peoples move forward. And so, yeah, let's celebrate 3rd of June, Mabo Day, and, you know, and make it that lots of people start having that conversations about the right thing that, for me, well, the right thing is that we celebrate this man, because, you know, he did it. He was the one who actually stood up to the Australian government and said, no, it's time to actually recognise us as the first peoples of this country. So, yeah.
Gail, Umbrella, I mean, through working with Gail, has decided to not celebrate Australia Day, so we don't have a public holiday on the 26th. We come to work and then we take our public holiday on Mabo Day. So I would encourage all the audience to have a think about maybe that's something you might want to do to celebrate Mabo's legacy. I really want to thank everybody. Thank you so much, Gail, Joe and Ron. Thank you to the audiences for joining us, and yeah, get in and see the exhibition. If you haven't seen it, get back in there and explore some more. There's some other sort of digital components. There's a kids activity that was created to explore Mabo's homeland, Mer Island, and you can learn how to make ghost nets with Marion Gamer, which is one of the artists in the show. But I guess from us, that's it. Thank you so much. And we'll see you when we see you maybe this year. Hopefully Gail will get back out on the road with the exhibition when it's safe to do so, and do some curatorial talks.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.